You're watching Echoes of the Past, the place where history whispers and shadows speak. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's step back in time and begin in the quiet hills of western Pennsylvania, where the earth still carries the scars of old coal mines. There's a cemetery that's baffled locals and historians for more than 100 years. 7 graves, 7 identical headstones, all carrying the same name, Murphy. Each one marks a young man, dead at exactly 2-1, not 1 or 2. But every male heir of the Murphy family between 1847 and 1883 met their end on their 21st birthday. Different causes, same result. So strange, so consistent, that the local authorities eventually stopped even trying to explain it. And here's where it gets darker. The Pennsylvania State Archives hold over 300 pages of medical files, sworn testimonies, witness statements, all sealed by the state in 1884, locked away, moved quietly into a restricted vault in Harrisburg. What you're about to hear, this is the story that's never been told until now. We've pieced it together from hidden family letters, court records nobody wanted public, and the private diary of Dr. Ezra Caldwell, the physician who treated 4 of the Murphy sons and spent the rest of his life obsessing over what he called the Murphy curse. But before we step deeper into this chilling piece of history, do me a favor. If mysterious true stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, because the truth behind what happened to the Murphy boys, it's darker and far more human than any ghost story you've ever heard. No spirits, no demons, just the brutal realities of 19th century America. Family secrets buried under coal dust, and a conspiracy of silence that protected the powerful while it destroyed the innocent. Let's go back to where it all began. The year was 1846. Seamus Murphy arrived in Millfield, Pennsylvania, a new coal town rising in the Appalachian foothills, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Like thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing famine, he carried little more than calloused hands, a sharp mind, and the hope of a better life. But Seamus wasn't like the rest. He had something most didn't: a letter of introduction from a mysterious Irish benefactor, someone who had paid for his passage and promised him a job with the Keystone Coal and Iron Company. Millfield wasn't just any coal town. It was a company town, a place built and owned by Keystone. Gray houses lined its dusty streets. The general store, the church, the school, even the cemetery plots, all belonged to the company. Life here ran on rules. No one spoke out loud, but everyone understood. And unlike other towns, Keystone handpicked its workforce. They didn't hire whoever showed up with a shovel. They targeted certain families, often desperate, displaced, or running from turmoil, and brought them in as part of what they proudly called the settlement program, a program that promised stability in exchange for total loyalty. Seamus was already older than most. New arrivals minus 28, with a weathered face that told a story of hard miles and harder choices. But he had a rare skill. He could read and write in both English and Gaelic that caught the attention of Josiah Bentley, Keystone's cold, calculating operations manager. Within weeks, Seamus moved off the mine floor and into the accounting office, a promotion that lifted him out of danger. but straight into the company's secrets. Those ledgers didn't just track paychecks. They tracked lives. Every man's debt at the company store. Every Sunday church attendance, children's school scores, even whispered notes about politics, drinking habits, friendships. And it was there, in an office thick with coal dust and hidden power, that Seamus met Margaret O'Connell. Margaret wasn't like other young women in Millfield. The daughter of one of the first Irish families Keystone recruited. She had a rare education, Latin, English, taught by nuns before. Her family crossed the ocean. She noticed details, saw through lies, and carried a quiet defiance beneath her polite smile. Their courtship was fast, fueled by both genuine affection and an unspoken understanding. In a place like Millfield, survival often depended on who you stood beside. They married in the fall of 1846 in a small Catholic church, crowded with neighbors and overseen by Father McKenna, a priest whose sermons always seemed a little too eager to preach obedience over faith. Margaret was striking, dark hair, storm-gray eyes, but it was her mind that drew Seamus in. She questioned things, the company, the town, the price of their good fortune. Their little home on Elm Street was one of the nicer cottages for Irish families. But, like everything in Millfield, it came with invisible strings, rules about when they could leave, who could visit, and what they could talk about inside walls that somehow never felt entirely private. And that, though no one could know it yet, was where the first shadow of the Murphy curse began to stretch. By the spring of 1847, change was already rolling in for the Murphys. Margaret was expecting their first child, and Seamus, careful, calculating, always saving, had finally scraped together enough money to buy a small patch of land on the edge of town, a place where he dreamed of building a real home, away from the watchful eyes of Keystone Coal. But when he went to seal the deal, the fine print hit like a gut punch. Hidden in the contract were agreements, clauses that would tie not just Seamus, but every future Murphy child to Keystone's settlement program. A quiet promise that when they came of age, his sons would belong to the company, body, mind, and labor. Meanwhile, Margaret's pregnancy was rough. Not the usual discomfort. Worse. Relentless nausea dragged on for months. But what truly unsettled her were the dreams, vivid, haunting dreams. She saw herself standing in a massive cemetery, row after row of matching headstones, names she didn't recognize, yet somehow knew. Young men, all of them bound together by something she couldn't explain. Dr. Ezra Caldwell, Millfield's only physician, examined her, prescribed rest and laudanum. But in the privacy of his journal, he admitted something chilling. Margaret's symptoms matched other women, wives of company men, whose pregnancies had all been marked by strange illnesses and stranger outcomes. And all around them, Millfield itself was a powder keg. Tensions ran deeper than the usual cultural divides. Irish Catholics, like the Murphys, were treated like second-class citizens by the older German and English Protestant families. Yet every worker, no matter their background, lived under the same dark cloud, the ever-present threat of cave-ins, explosions, debt, and corporate control that seeped into every corner of their lives. Wages came in company scrip, worthless outside Keystone property, keeping families in an endless cycle of debt. And the so-called ladder of advancement. It wasn't a ladder at all. It was a leash. Show loyalty, get rewarded. Show independence, get crushed. Union men who tried to organize were met with fists, knives, sometimes bullets, and every now and then someone would simply disappear into the Pennsylvania woods, never to return. And in the Irish Quarter, people whispered about families who had tried to leave. Families whose wagons broke, whose savings suddenly vanished, whose debts mysteriously doubled overnight until leaving became impossible. It was in this world, built on coal, control, and quiet coercion, that the Murphys' first tragedy took shape. The baby arrived, strong, healthy, a boy, Patrick, named after Seamus's father. But from the moment he drew breath, his life had already been bargained away, shaped by deals, debts, and promises made long before his parents ever stepped foot in Melfi LD. And 21 years later, that bargain would come due. March 15th, 1868, Patrick Murphy's 21st birthday. The day dawned gray and cold. Snow still clung stubbornly to the Appalachian slopes. The air carried that strange metallic temps, the one that always came just before a storm. Seamus had planned a modest celebration at McBride's Tavern, one of the only places in town where the Irish felt truly welcome. But that morning, Patrick wasn't himself. He looked pale at breakfast, quiet, distant. "You're looking peaked, my boy," Margaret said, pressing her hand to his forehead. "Maybe you should stay home today." But Patrick, his father's stubborn streak in full bloom, refused. He had just been promoted to shift supervisor in one of the deepest, most dangerous tunnels, Shaft 7, a position that drew both respect and scrutiny from Keystone's overseers. Missing work on his birthday wasn't an option. At 6 a.m., he reported as usual, collected his lamp, his gear, led his crew, 12 men, mostly Irish, a few Germans, into the earth, 400 feet down, where the coal was richest, and the walls least stable. At exactly 2:17 p.m., Millfield shook. A methane explosion tore through Shaft 7 with surgical precision. Windows rattled, women screamed and ran into the streets. The town had seen mine disasters before, but not like this. This one was too clean, too contained. 3 hours later, the rescue team reached the wrecked tunnel. 11 men were battered but breathing, thrown against the walls, coughing in the dark. Patrick was dead, but not burned, not crushed, not even bruised. He was found at the very center of the blast site, lying as if asleep, untouched by fire or debris. Dr. Caldwell wrote later in his journal, Patrick didn't die from the explosion. He died the instant it happened. His body simply stopped, as if something had called time, and the surviving miners all told the same story. Patrick had paused mid-sentence, checked his pocket watch, smiled. "Time's up," he said, seconds later. The blast. 3 days after the funeral, a letter was found in Patrick's coat pocket, written in his own hand, dated 2 weeks before the explosion. Inside, burial instructions, a list of personal effects for his siblings at the bottom. In his neat, careful script were 5 haunting words. "The first payment is made. The debt continues with my brothers." Keystone blamed Patrick. Officially, the report pinned the explosion on his negligence, though they never explained how one man could cause such a precise disaster, or why he was the only one who didn't make it out alive. A small settlement was paid. To the Murphy family, the files were sealed, the case closed, but Dr. Caldwell kept his notes and his suspicions, because he knew what no one dared say out loud. Patrick Murphy's death wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of a pattern. And 5 years later, right on schedule, the second Murphy's son would take his place in that terrible line. Patrick Murphy's death left a hole no words could fill. For a while, grief was everywhere, raw, unbearable. But as months passed, it dulled. Life in Millfield went back to its grinding rhythm. Work, eat, sleep, survive. Seamus buried himself in the company office, as if drowning in ledgers could keep the nightmares at bay. Margaret, she didn't just grieve, she seemed to age a decade overnight. The once bright woman with raven hair now carried streaks of silver, her eyes often distant, unfocused. But the one who changed the most was Thomas. Patrick had been steady, serious. Thomas was fire, brilliant, reckless, quick to challenge injustice, even when it put him in danger. He had Margaret's sharp intelligence, but not Patrick's careful restraint. He clashed with supervisors, defended co-workers, orders. And after Patrick's death, he started asking the kind of questions no one in Millfield wanted answered. Thomas spent nights in the dusty little town library. He tracked down every mining safety report, every article on gas explosions, every detail about Shaft 7. He hunted down Patrick's old crew, men who had fled Millfield, some who had left mining entirely, and pressed them for every memory they had. And what he found was worse than he'd feared. Company records showed Shaft 7 had been flagged as unsafe, dangerous methane levels, ignored warnings. Weeks before Patrick's shift, Patrick had been ordered to work a double that day, a direct violation of company policy in higher-risk tunnels. And then came the smoking gun, a letter hidden among Seamus's papers, signed by Josiah Bentley himself, ordering Patrick on his birthday to conduct a special inspection of the gas pockets in Shaft 7. When Thomas confronted his father with it, the reaction was immediate and terrifying. Seamus, quiet, careful, obedient. Seamus turned red with rage. He snatched the letter from Thomas's hands, tossed it into the fire, and spoke in a voice so low it chilled his son's blood. "Some secrets," he said, "are better left buried, boy. Your brother's dead. No digging will bring him back. Drop this before you join him." But Thomas couldn't let it go as he neared his own 21st birthday. Thomas dug deeper. He met secretly with exquisite men, those who had quit or been pushed out, or simply vanished from the records. Their stories painted a picture of corruption that stretched far beyond one explosion. Union organizers who had accidents, whistleblowers who disappeared into the Pennsylvania woods, quiet agreements between Keystone and certain wealthy families, deals that kept the coal flowing, no matter the cost in human lives. And then came the whispers, the kind old miners, only told after too many drinks, blood contracts, pacts made decades earlier, agreements that bound certain families to the company in ways no one dared write down, agreements that demanded a price paid in lives. Always, on special birthdays. Always, the sons, always just as they came of age, the moment they could inherit names, power, or a future beyond Milfield. By the spring of 1873, Thomas was unraveling. He carried a pistol everywhere, refused to walk alone, claimed someone was following him through Millfield's narrow streets. One morning, Margaret found him fully dressed at dawn, staring out his bedroom window at the rising sun, face hollow with exhaustion. "They're coming for me, Ma," he said, quietly, "just like they came for Patrick. But I'm not going to make it easy for them." Margaret tried to soothe him, tried to believe it was just grief twisting his thoughts, but deep in her chest, dread bloomed like ice. The night before his birthday, she fell to her knees before a small shrine in her room, surrounded by candles, rosaries, whispered prayers, pleading with a God she feared no longer listened. But some prayers don't bring comfort. Some only bring what comes next. March 22nd, 1873, Thomas Murphy's 21st birthday. The morning arrived, wrapped in fog so thick the mountains vanished. Millfield felt cut off from the world, a ship adrift in gray silence. Thomas had prepared carefully, but no preparation could stop what was about to unfold. Unlike Patrick, who had died deep underground, Thomas's end would come in the open, in daylight, witnessed by dozens, yet remain just as impossible to explain. He called in sick to the timber mill that morning. Instead, he climbed the bell tower of St. Michael's Catholic Church, the same church where he'd been baptized. He turned the sacred space into a fortress, barricaded the stairwell with pew benches, armed himself with his father's old hunting rifle and a box of cartridges. When Father O'Malley, the aging priest who had baptized every Murphy child, entered for his morning prayers, he found Thomas, their gaunt, hollow-eyed clothes hanging off him as if he'd stopped eating entirely. "Thomas, my son," the priest said gently, hands raised in peace. What happened next would leave the entire town of Millfield shaken, and it would prove beyond doubt that whatever haunted the Murphy family wasn't done yet. Imagine walking into a church and finding a young man armed to the teeth. Asked, "What troubles bring you here, son, with weapons like these?" Thomas Murphy's answer was anything but simple. At first, it sounded like paranoia, and the more it sounded like a horrifying truth. He said his brother Patrick hadn't died in a mining accident. He'd been murdered, sacrificed on his 21st birthday as part of something older and darker than anyone dared admit. A blood contract signed long ago that tied the Murphy family to Keystone Coal and Iron. Every generation, every son, every 21st birthday paid in death. And now it was Thomas's turn. "They're coming for me today, Father," he whispered, his voice breaking. "When I'm gone, they'll come for Michael, for James, for little Brendan. Every one of Usantil, no Murphy men are left." Chilling, isn't it? The priest tried to calm him, offered prayers, but Thomas wasn't looking for comfort. He claimed he'd uncovered proofreal documents, hidden a wave that showed the contract was real. From there, he swore he'd spot his killers, stop them before they reached him. He whispered, pointing. 3 men, dark coats, coming for me. He raised his rifle, determined to end it. What happened next would shock everyone who saw it. The moment Thomas fired, the gun itself exploded. Not a misfire, not bad maintenance. The weapon literally tore itself apart, shattering in his hands. The blast killed him instantly, hurling his body against the stone wall, and then silence. When Father O'Malley woke from the faint that overtook him, he found Thomas's body, not mangled, not twisted, but kneeling, hands clasped, face peaceful, as if death had gently carried him away. The official verdict: defective ammunition, a tragedy, case closed. But the questions didn't stop there. Those mysterious strangers, never identified. Some said they weren't even real. And Father O'Malley's private journal Lee found decades later revealed a detail the company ignored. At the exact moment of Thomas's death, every clock in Millfield froze, stuck for 21 seconds, before ticking on as if nothing had happened. The town mourned. But the one who changed most wasn't Margaret or the neighbors, it was Seamus Murphy, Thomas's father. Instead of grieving quietly, Seamus turned furious, obsessed. The morning after the funeral, he stormed into Keystone's office, clutching a leather satchel, demanding to see Josiah Bentley himself. What happened in that closed-door meeting? No one really knows, but witnesses heard shouting, things breaking, the sound of a man coming undone. When Seamus finally emerged, pale and shaken, the satchel was gone. Bentley, too, looked broken, canceling appointments, staring out at the mountains for hours. The company ledgers, mistakes, so obvious people wondered if they were deliberate, and he warned others, beware of promises that seem too good. Ever notice how some tragedies don't stop with one death? They ripple through generations, like a curse no one dares name. That's what was happening in Millfield. And at the center of it all was the Murphy family. After losing 2 sons in ways no parent should ever have to imagine, Margaret Murphy watched her husband unravel whiskey, rage, wild outbursts. But it wasn't just Seamus slipping. Margaret herself started changing too. Every evening, she wandered to the cemetery, at first to visit her boys, but then she started studying the other graves, the names, the ages, the patterns, and what she found. It chilled her to her bones. At least a dozen young men, all dead at 21, all in accidents that didn't quite add up. A German boy, Johann Steiner, who fell from scaffolding, even though he was known as one of the workers in town. Petro Rossini, crushed by a minicart he'd personally inspected just hours earlier. Edward Flanagan, an expert swimmer, somehow drowned in the shallow creek running through town. Each case looked random, but none of them really were. Every single one of those young men had been offered special opportunities by Keystone, coal and iron, right before their deaths. Every family had been compensated generously, almost suspiciously so. And every victim left behind notes, letters, scribbles that hinted at something coming, something they couldn't stop. And then it got worse. Michael Murphy, Margaret's 3rd son, just 19, started digging too. What he found would blow the whole thing open. Hidden in the church basement were documents no one was supposed to see. Contracts, old, faded, written partly in English, partly in legal Latin that barely anyone could still read. They dated back to the 1820s, when Keystone Coal first came to Pennsylvania, and the signatures. Some belonged to men Margaret had never met. Others were horrifyingly familiar. One of them appeared to belong to Seamus's own father. The meaning was sickeningly clear. These weren't just job contracts. They were blood deals, according to Michael's translation. Families had been promised steady work, housing, protection, in exchange for something unthinkable. A tithe paid in blood. Every generation. The eldest son, dead on his 21st birthday. His death staged to look like an accident. In return, the family's survivors were safe, employed, looked after, as long as they obeyed. On a freezing night in December 1873, Michael laid the papers out on the kitchen table while the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Seamus's reaction was explosive. He swept the documents to the floor, tore them apart, cursed in English and Gaelic like a man possessed. "Burn them," he screamed. "Burn them all and never speak of this again. You want to join your brothers in the ground. You want to destroy what little protection we have left." But Margaret, quiet, haunted Margaret, had already seen enough. While her husband destroyed the originals, she secretly kept copies, and with them she began to plan. If the Murphy family was shackled to a contract signed in blood, then maybe, just maybe, it was time to renegotiate or die trying. That winter was brutal. Snow piled high. Temperatures dropped lower than anyone could remember. But inside the Murphy home, it wasn't the cold outside that froze them. It was the silence, the suspicion, the weight of knowing what was coming. February 14th, 1874, exactly 2 months before Michael's 21st birthday, Margaret made her move. She wasn't going to sit and wait for another son to die. She studied the deaths, the patterns. One thing stood out. Every boy died alone. No witnesses, no help, not this time. Margaret went to Father O'Malley, the only man in Millfield who had seen even a piece of what was really happening. She told him everything. The patterns, the contracts, the blood price. At first, the priest tried to turn her away. He'd seen what happened when people pushed too hard. Thomas's death in the bell tower still haunted him. But when Margaret placed her secret copies in his hands, his resistance cracked. His face went pale, and he agreed. They would try to save Michael. What happened next would test everything they thought they knew about faith, loyalty, and the price of survival. Ever wonder how deep a town's secrets can go? What if I told you a church, a coal company, and generations of families were bound together by something so dark it cost people their lives? Father O'Malley couldn't shake the feeling that the tragedy around the Murphy family wasn't random. So he dug into the church's oldest records, and what he found turned his blood cold. Millfield's beloved Catholic parish, entirely paid for by Keystone Coal and Iron. And over the years, priests hadn't just given blessings, they'd witnessed contracts, deals that blurred the line between faith and law, between God and greed. Then came the bombshell. Behind a false wall in the church sacristy sat a ledger, neat handwriting, carefully kept, listing what were chillingly described as spiritual transactions, families, dates, obligations, payments, and in that ledger, the Murphy family entry, written in Seamus Murphy's father's own hand. It spelled it out clearly: 7 sons. A blood price for safe passage and prosperity. With that kind of evidence, Margaret and Father O'Malley knew there was no time to waste. They had to act, not just to save Michael, but every family still chained to those same brutal promises. The plan: rally other victims' relatives, gather undeniable proof, and take the whole rotten machine to authorities far outside Millfield's reach, beyond Keystone's shadow. But Michael Murphy wasn't the hiding type. He'd inherited the Murphy stubbornness and a kind of courage that sometimes looked like recklessness. When he learned what his mother and the priest were plotting, he refused to run. Instead, he offered a plan of his own, bold, dangerous, maybe even suicidal. He'd confront Keystone head-on, early March, freezing cold, 2 weeks before Michael's 21st birthday, he marched straight into Keystone's offices, contract in hand, and demanded a meeting with Josiah Bentley and the company board. Witnesses later said it was like watching the air in the room turn poisonous. Bentley, usually calm, sharp, untouchable, started to unravel. He muttered in a strange mix of English and some other language no one could recognize. His eyes kept darting toward the windows, like he was waiting for something or someone to burst in. The other officials, they didn't panic, they calculated. Ezra Caldwell, not the town doctor, but his cousin, Keystone's lawyer, whispered with the others, then laid out an offer, a deal. Michael's silence in exchange for freedom. No more obligations, a huge payout, a clean escape if they left Millfield quietly and never spoke of it again. They gave him 24 hours. Michael didn't need 24 seconds. He said no, flat, immediate. He promised to take the truth to the state, to Washington, even to the press if he had to. As he turned to leave, Caldwell called out after him, his words slicing through the air like a curse. Some debts can't be forgiven, young Murphy. Some contracts can't be broken. Your brothers learned that lesson, and so will you. That night, 3 men in dark coats followed Michael through the streets. The same kind of figures his brother Thomas had once spotted from the church bell tower. But this time, Michael wasn't alone. Margaret had already built a quiet shield around her son, Father O'Malley, Dr. Ezra Caldwell, the physician, not the lawyer. A handful of brave townsfolk. They kept watch, ready to drag the truth into the light. If Keystone tried to silence him the old way, then came the twist no one saw coming. Morning broke with shocking news. Josiah Bentley, dead, found slumped over his desk, face frozen in sheer terror, one hand gripping a half-written letter. The first words were clear as day. The contracts must end. Before the writing dissolved into an illegible scrawl, and just like that, Keystone cracked wide open. Officials started panicking, talking, confessing, not out of guilt, out of fear. Turns out the contracts weren't supernatural, no curses, no demons, just human greed, weaponized with superstition, fear, and cold-blooded murder. Patrick Murphy, a gas explosion, timed, engineered, controlled. Thomas, his rifle sabotaged with special rounds meant to explode. Other sons, accidents staged with surgical precision, subtle enough to fool coroners, brutal enough to keep families terrified and obedient. And then the doctor's journals came out. Millfield's only physician, forced to falsify death certificates, testify falsely, all while secretly documenting everything. Names, methods, even the assassins themselves, a traveling crew of killers moving from town to town, making accidents happen wherever families became too bold or too valuable. To lose control of it wasn't a curse, it was a machine. And for decades, it had run on blood, silence, and fear. Now, it was burning down, and Michael Murphy, he'd just lit the match. Ever think breaking a curse might cost more than living with it? Michael Murphy made it past his 21st birthday, the first son in his family ever to outrun the cycle of death that had claimed so many before him. But survival came with a price, one that would stalk the Murphys for generations. The conspiracy they had dragged into the light didn't die quietly. It struck back hard. Within weeks of Josiah Bentley's death and the chaos that followed, the Murphy family started getting letters, threats from names they didn't recognize. Their cottage vandalized. Seamus lost his job. Suddenly, shopkeepers who'd served them for years wouldn't sell them a loaf of bread. And it wasn't just them. Other families who'd stepped forward started to suffer. Houses caught fire. In the middle of the night, mine shafts collapsed. Accidents, according to the company. Witnesses disappeared without a trace. The message was simple. Speaking the truth was a death sentence. Then came the fire. Father O'Malley's church burned to the ground. That April, the official story blamed a faulty stove. But everyone in Millfield knew the truth. It was payback. The priest barely escaped with his life and fled to a parish in Philadelphia, carrying copies of the documents Margaret had saved. He never spoke of Millfield again. Dr. Caldwell wasn't so lucky. Just days before testifying before a state labor commission, he was found dead in his office. Laudanum poisoning suicide, they said. His note claimed guilt had finally broken him. But those who really knew him doubted it. They knew a setup when they saw one. The Murphys themselves were barely holding on. In May, Seamus was beaten nearly to death on a country road. Margaret fell ill. Mysterious symptoms no doctor could explain. Even young Brendan, just 14, was harassed. At school and on the street, it became painfully clear. Stay in Millfield, and they'd all end up like Patrick and Thomas, or worse. So they ran. Summer 1874, in the dead of night, carrying only 2 travel bags and hearts heavy with grief. The Murphys left behind their home, their belongings, and the graves of their boys. They boarded a train bound for Oregon Territory, chasing a fragile dream of safety on the far side of the country. The trip west was brutal, not just physically, but mentally. Every station, every crowd, Seamus scanned faces, searching for killers in disguise. Margaret held her sons close, praying they hadn't just postponed the inevitable. Finally, they settled in a logging town called Cedar Falls, deep in the Cascade Mountains, 60 miles east of Portland. The work was dangerous, but it was honest. No contracts, no hidden blood debts. For the first time in years, they dared to hope. Michael found love, marrying Sarah Donnelly in 1876, and took a job scouting timber for sawmills. Together they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a boy they named Patrick, after the brother Michael had lost. Brendan grew into a school teacher, later a respected principal. When his 21st birthday passed without tragedy, the family breathed easier, maybe. Finally, the nightmare was over. But some shadows are longer than others. In 1885, Michael's son Patrick turned 16. That's when the dreams started. Strange, vivid, relentless. Along with them came an obsession, a pull to dig into the family's buried history. Michael begged him to leave the past alone, but the boy couldn't. Through labor activists, old newspapers, and sympathetic journalists, young Patrick pieced together what his father had tried so hard to bury. The contracts, the deaths, the machine that had chewed through generations for profit. And what he found next was even worse. The Murphy family wasn't unique. Across the eastern United States, hidden in company towns and under legal cover, the same system had thrived for decades. Immigrant families treated like assets, controlled, manipulated, and, if necessary, erased. And some of those families, they'd never escaped, not even after moving hundreds of miles away. The networks had adapted, evolved, found new ways to keep their claws in the bloodlines they considered theirs. The Murphys thought they'd outrun the darkness, but the darkness had learned how to follow. Ever wonder what happens when a family fights back and wins? By the spring of 1887, life in Cedar Falls had started to feel safe again, or so the Murphys hoped. But then the signs crept back in. Strangers asking quiet questions about their name, accidents that didn't make sense, people close to them getting hurt, some just disappearing, and that feeling, that cold, crawling sense, like someone was always watching from just out of sight. Michael Murphy knew those signals. They were the same whispers of death that had come before every tragedy back in Pennsylvania. But this time, the Murphys weren't scared little pawns anymore. They'd learned they had allies, and they weren't going to run. Instead, they set a trap, not a quiet one, a loud one. March 15th, 1888, 20 years to the day since Patrick Murphy Sr. had died in Shaft 7. His nephew, his namesake, stood in the center of Cedar Falls main square, turning 21 under a sky thick with tension. But he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by more than 50 armed friends, loggers, miners, union men, ready to stare death in the face. Reporters stood nearby, notebooks ready. Word had spread across the region. This wasn't just a birthday party. It was a declaration, and then, like clockwork, they came. 3 men in dark coats, professional killers sent to finish what had begun decades earlier, walked straight toward Patrick. But this time, they weren't stepping into a quiet street. They were stepping into a trap. Within minutes, the hunters were the hunted, overpowered, disarmed, taken alive in front of witnesses and newspapers and a furious crowd that had been waiting years for this fight. What came next would shake America's industrial world. Those men talked, and when they did, they spilled everything: names, contracts, the entire hidden network of control that had operated for decades in the shadows. Their confessions sparked arrests in 12 states. Dozens of wealthy industrialists, untouchable men, were dragged into court. Hundreds of families who'd been chained to blood contracts they didn't even know they were trapped in were finally freed. And in 1889, the last of those cursed contracts was torn apart by federal order. Just like that, the Murphy family and every other family in that nightmare were legally, permanently, officially free. The case became a turning point. New labor laws were written, loopholes closed, systems of human inheritance disguised as employment gone. Patrick Murphy Jr., the boy they tried to kill, lived long enough to see his own kids grow up without fear. The Murphy name, once whispered like a curse, became a symbol of courage, resistance, and justice. But they never forgot where it started. 7 graves in a quiet Pennsylvania cemetery, reminders of sons stolen young, not by fate or ghosts or any curse, but by greed, cruelty, and men who thought no one would ever dare stand against them. Dr. Ezra Caldwell's journals, found after his death, became weapons of truth, exposing similar schemes across the industrial Northeast, sparking safety, reforms, and saving lives for decades. Millfield, the town where it all began, didn't survive the scandal. Keystone Coal and Iron went bankrupt in 1875, and without its poisoned heart-pumping money, the town withered away. Today, only cracked foundations and an overgrown graveyard marked the ground where so many innocent lives were stolen. But the story survived. And maybe that's the most important part, because it proves something chilling and powerful at the same time, that the worst horrors aren't always supernatural. They're human, built from greed, fueled by fear, protected by silence. The Murphy boys didn't die because of a curse. They died because men in power decided their lives were acceptable losses in the name of profit. And yet, ordinary people, scared, grieving, furious, found the courage to fight back and win. So, what do you think? Was everything truly brought into the light? Or are there still names, still secrets, buried in old ledgers and forgotten ruins like Millfield, waiting to be found? If this story gave you chills, share it with someone who loves hidden history. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell, because the truth, it's often stranger, darker, and more dangerous than fiction. And there are still stories like this, waiting to be told.